Hi, good morning to everyone who's watching. Good morning to you, or afternoon, or close to afternoon to you, Pip. I got a chance to meet you shortly backstage, but I just wanted to once again say I am so excited, so grateful, and um, I'm excited. I've been wanting, I've been waiting for this conversation, and thank you so much for joining us, Pip.
Oh, Natasha, it's such a pleasure to be here. I've been really looking forward to it ever since you got in touch. I think the work that your organisation does is just, extraordinary. And I feel very humbled, really, that you wanted to talk to me. So thank you so much for the invitation.
You're very welcome, Pip. I mean, you're very right in a sense that the reason why we wanted to have this conversation with you is because we are in the work of activism. We are constantly using words strategically, unconsciously, consciously, sometimes reproducing biases and prejudices, sometimes correcting them. And so when I got a hold of your book, which uh, enlivened me in so many ways, I thought, well, we've got to talk about words and the words we have lost and the words whose meanings have changed over time. And you capture it in a beautiful novel. Uh, and Pip, I wanted to ask you, why did you call it the Dictionary of Lost Words?
There were a few things that made me write this novel. And the very first thing was an idea that I had. And it just came to me kind of like, some people say this, and I always wonder what it would feel like. And then I had one of those lightning moments where I had an idea that I thought was important. And I don't know that I've ever had an idea that I thought was really important before. But I knew that this was, and I read this book, which is The Surgeon of Crowthorne. Pretty much everywhere else in the world, it's called The Professor and the Madman. And it's about the Oxford English Dictionary. It's non-fiction, but it was about the relationship between the editor of the dictionary and one of the more prolific volunteers, people who sent in words with examples of how they'd been used in novels and other types of books. It's a really interesting story, but by the end of it, I had an understanding of how the dictionary had been compiled, how it had been put together, how all the words in the English language had been defined. And let's be clear, we use language all the time. We use words the way we want to use words. The English language in particular is very dynamic and it changes over time. And it's used slightly differently by different groups of people. But this was a project that wanted to pin the language down. It wanted to define the words. And what I realised suddenly, even though I'd turned to dictionaries my whole life as the arbiters of truth, they could not be argued with. They were objective and they were scholarly and they were right. And what I realised suddenly was that they were human objects. Dictionaries had been made by humans and therefore must be full of human frailty. And when I read this book, I realised that the dictionary that, in fact, in the English language we hold above all other dictionaries, the Oxford English Dictionary, was completely developed by men initially, because it was a project of Victorian England. It started in 1858 and the first edition was completed in 1928. And for a word to get into the dictionary, it had to have been written down. And I realised that most of the words that had been written down before the 19th century, before the 20th century, were written down by men. And all of the people defining the language, sorting through all of those words to try and come up with definitions, were men. And I'm a social scientist. My background is social science. And initially I just thought the idea was, oh my goodness, this project was biased. It has a massive gender bias, because if only men were putting the dictionary together and their data was only from male writers on the whole, what does that mean for the language that they've defined? Does it mean that their definitions perhaps are biased towards men's experience? And that was the idea that I had. And I couldn't really explore it from a social science point of view. I couldn't really find what I needed just by searching the internet or going to the library. And I thought the best way to explore it really was to put a little girl under the sorting table where all the words of the English language were being defined, and imagine how those words might affect her as she grows into a woman, but also how she, as a young woman living in a really interesting time in history, how she might affect the words. And so that's where I started with the idea. And the reason it's called the Dictionary of Lost Words is because the very first word that comes into this little girl's possession is the word bondmaid. Now, this is a real, this is history, this is fact. The word bondmaid, which means slave girl, was lost from that very first dictionary, which I have sitting here. This is a first edition of A and B. And if I open it to B, I will come across bondman, and then there is no entry for bondmaid. Because even though it was a word that had been written down many, many times, unfortunately, because bondmaids have been part of our history and still are, they're still part of, life for many people. Even though that word had been written down 1,000 times, it should have been in the dictionary, but it wasn't. It was literally lost. So it was written on a slip of paper and somehow never made it to the printers where it got typeset for the dictionary. So it was genuinely lost, and no one knows how. They just know that it was missing from that first dictionary. And so because no one knows how it was lost, I could make it up. And so that's the very first interaction that my character has with the words of the English language and of the dictionary.
Pip, thank you for that beautiful summary of in a way, the history of how a dictionary is compiled. As you said, no one really thinks about what words are chosen to be included and why. And what stood out for me was that only if those words were defined in some sort of journal or in writing, then they would be regarded as a credible way of using the word.
Yes.
But what does this make of women's experiences or the experiences of the working class and other marginalized groups?
Well, that's one of the things that I became incredibly interested in, because I realised that it wasn't just women's words that might have been missing from that first dictionary, and actually from dictionaries that have been written since. And this is now up to its third edition. So, of course, it's evolved, just like our culture has evolved. But I was really interested to know, do words actually even mean different things to different people? Like, that was the first question, really, because if we all mean the same thing when we say a word, it doesn't really matter who defines it. But I didn't believe that we all used words the same way. And I also thought that there were absolutely going to be words that were used in the birthing room, for instance, or in the scullery, or down the mines, or in the trenches of World War I, words that might not have been written down because the people who wrote books were never in those places. They were never there to hear the words and to really understand how the words were being used and what the meanings were. And what I did find when I went into the archives of the Oxford English Dictionary is actually that, I had access. I mean, it's really quite extraordinary. They gave me access to the original slips. So I was saying earlier that the Oxford English Dictionary, in a way, is the first crowdsourced project, because James Murray, who was the editor at the time, when he took over, he realised the project would never get done if they just relied on, a handful of really well-educated Oxford and Cambridge men. What they needed was the general population to participate in this project. And so he sent out a call through journals and magazines and newspapers for people to send in examples of how words had been used. And they can use examples from books, but they can also use them from newspapers, from medicine labels on bottles, anywhere where a word had been written down. that was a valid use of a valid reason for a word to be in the dictionary. But it did have to be written in script. And so he had thousands of people from around the world, including Australia and Singapore and the United States, and pretty much anywhere where people spoke English. They would send in these slips. And so I had access to these archived slips, thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of them. And they're all in alphabetical order. So I can have a look at how the words had been used in the various ways that words might have been used in writing, of course. And then I could compare that to the dictionary that was published. And I could see that some senses of a word might have been left out of the dictionary, perhaps because it was only ever recorded on a single slip of paper, not on 4 or 5. There weren't many examples of it. That might be one reason why a word wouldn't get into the dictionary. Because there were so few examples of it being used in writing. And I also found evidence of words that had been, they were going to be in the dictionary. So I had the proof page, the penultimate kind of printed page. And then an editor had put a line through the word with the word excise next to it. So they'd literally taken the word out of what was going to be the dictionary. And in some cases, these were words that had been coined by women. So women authors, novelists, and so on. Now, of course, as a novelist, I was picking and choosing some of the things that I would put in the novel, but everything in the novel that refers to words from the Oxford English Dictionary, either in the dictionary or excised from the dictionary, is true. So I didn't make up any words. Even the words that we know.
Excised?
Say that again.
What were some of the words that were excised?
Okay, so some of the words that were excised, well, one in particular is the word literately. Now, it's a word that we all understand because we could all put it in a sentence without even thinking too hard. But you could say, oh, she spoke very literately, or she wrote that letter very literately. And it was a word that was used in a novel by a Mrs. Griffiths back in the 18th century. And she had 5 lines dedicated to this word in the dictionary using her quotation from her novel, which was much like I just used then. And I found the proof pages and a line had been put through it and it had been excised. So it didn't end up in the dictionary. But on the same page was the word literata. And the word literata means a literary lady. And it was right before literati, which means literary person. And what I found really interesting was that we needed to separate women from the literati. Women weren't people. There's this implication that the literati really are just men. And that when they use the word people, they are automatically excluding women from that. If you then need a new word to describe an intelligent woman. Anyway, that word stayed in, and it had the same number of examples of usage, but it was written by Coleridge. And so Coleridge was a well-respected literati, member of the literati, and his word stayed in the dictionary, whereas Mrs. Griffith's word was excised. And for me, that was just emblematic, if you like, of so much that we still experience today when you think of how many women's words get into the literary pages of a newspaper, whether as an edit, whether as a literary critic or their book being reviewed or so on. We have people in different countries who literally measure how many words are dedicated to men's work and how many words are dedicated to women's work, and it's still unequal. And that was just this lovely example of that happening, 100 years ago in the dictionary.
May I ask you, I had listened to, I'm a big fan, so I listened to several of your interviews before, and one of the examples you gave was how the word menstruation was defined. Could you tell us more about that?
Yes, so this was interesting because I was really interested in following my character Esme from the age of 4 right through to womanhood. And of course, that means that she goes through puberty during the story, and she's motherless. And this is a really important aspect of the story in a way. I kind of needed her to be, I suppose, in a situation where she didn't have a mother who she could turn to at various points in her life. And she instead turns to the words that she is surrounded by. Her father is a lexicographer, so he turns to the words. In some ways, he has shown her that the words will help her to understand the world. And she is literally surrounded by the words. So she spends her time in the scriptorium, which is where they were doing this work. And it is lined with these little pigeonholes, which are stuffed full of those slips of paper I was telling you about. And it also, as the dictionary progresses, you know, it is also filling up with all of the fascicles, which are just small sections of the dictionary. And she has access to all of these words. And so when something happens to her that she doesn't understand, she turns to the words to try and understand. And so when she starts menstruating, her father, bless his heart, her father sort of introduces her to the word menstruation. You know, he goes straight to the sort of dictionary definition of what's happening to her. But of course, you know, dictionary definitions don't really often explain what's going on. She also talks to Lizzie, who is the maid in James Murray's house, who looks after her quite a lot. And she talks to Lizzie about this thing that's happening to her. And Lizzie introduces other words like the curse. And so what Esme does is she turns to the words in the scriptorium. She looks up menstruation. She looks up curse. Now, menstruation, actually, the word that would have been used back then, menstruation wasn't the word that would have been more commonly used. It was catamenia, which is a word I'd never heard of. And catamenia is the bleeding that women experience. But there were other words, and one of them was menstrosity. And there were all these words that sounded monstrous.
And does mania mean mad? Like it's to attribute?
Yeah. Yes, I think so. Yeah, and we all know the history of, you know, hysteria as well. You know, so many words that describe madness or a sense of being unhinged or unreliable or any of those things do come from words that describe women's bodies. They're, you know, like hysteria is one. Mania, I think, is another, but I'm not sure about that. But just the way the dictionary described women's bodies and women's bodily functions was very obtuse. It never really, because this is a 19th century project, and it was stuffy old white men who were writing the words down, and it's almost like they couldn't bring themselves to say some things. So many words are not in the dictionary, and if they are in the dictionary, they use very, very scientific ways of describing the functions. So I think clitoris is in the dictionary, but I didn't understand a word in the definition and there was certainly no reference to pleasure at all in the definition of clitoris, for instance. And what Esme realizes is that the dictionary is inadequate, that the definitions of these words are not adequate to her experience. And she suddenly has this, she loves the dictionary. She loves the words. This is her place of comfort. It's where she turns when she needs help. And this is a moment in her life, and adolescence is, where she suddenly realizes that what she has held up to such high esteem is falling short. And I think adolescents sometimes think this about their parents. You know, suddenly they start to question the authority of their parents, or the wisdom of their parents, or even the experience of their parents. And she realizes then that words are inadequate sometimes to experience. but to particular experience, to her experience as a girl turning into a woman, the words could not help her. And the words that, were used around her, like curse and other words, they really denigrated the experience and made her feel polluted. And that is one of the words, that is one of the definitions of menstruation. It is a pollution. That word is used in the definition. And this is what she was learning to live by.
Yeah, in fact, Pip, so I'm a Muslim, so in our holy book, the Quran, where it refers to menstruation, the English translation uses the word pollution as well. So when I grew up understanding that menstruation was in a sense a pollution. And it was only when I started to read books written by women that doesn't define menstruation as the blood coming out, but as a cycle of a body where the body is changing and you've got to be in tune with what it's telling you. It turns it from being something dirty, shameful, something to be hidden, to something to be celebrated, that your body is in a renewal, it's in a new birth. And I must say that I only started to learn, well, just in terms of menstruation, I only started to learn that side of menstruation or the cycle in with new words. And that's why the words is so important, because it's a normative type of process. It defines for you what your experience should and can be, no?
That's right. And it also means you can share it with other people. If we don't have a word for something, it makes it very difficult for us to share our experience or our history or our connection. And I think about this a lot with Indigenous languages. So around the world, countries and peoples have been colonized. And when a people are colonized, the first thing that is taken is their land, but the second thing that is taken is their language. And when you take anybody's language away from them, or you make it difficult for them to communicate, you are taking away their history, their kinship, their connection to place. But worst and most of all, you are actually taking away the opportunity for reconciliation and understanding between different peoples. So in Australia, this is something that is really important at the moment. Aboriginal languages, and we have hundreds of them in Australia, and many of them have been lost and others have been almost forgotten, but in many cases they're now being renewed. And sometimes that's because Europeans wrote some of it down when they first settled in Australia. So in the case of Adelaide, where I live, the Kaurna people, which are the traditional owners of the Adelaide Plains, there was a bunch of German missionaries that came back in the 1850s, and they sat down with Aboriginal elders on the Adelaide Plains, and they wrote down the language that they were speaking with the cooperation of the elders. And they wrote it down in their way. They interpreted it their way. But it is the best record that we have of the Kaurna language. And since the 1990s, I think, that language is being revived by, some elders who still had some language with them, but also using I suppose, the sort of work of these amateur lexicographers who were writing down words and meanings. And that language now is being spoken by Kaurna children, and also by white fellas who are interested in learning it. Now, by speaking the language of the Kaurna people, we have a better understanding of what has been lost for them, and also what is important, and how their kinships work, and all of these sorts of things. But without your traditional language, you find it difficult to communicate those things. And that's one of the reasons language is so important. I have another really interesting example of a secret language, which I only came across recently. It's an ancient women's language from China, from the Hunan province, I think, and it may go back 3,000 years, but it's a language. Do you know of this?
No.
Do you know of this language? I think it's called Nushu, Nushu, and it was a script. It was a written language, even though it was used among illiterate peasant women mostly. It was quite popular in the 19th century, but they do date it back, maybe 2,000 years, perhaps even 3,000 years. And it was a language that was used in this province, which I think is quite an isolated province with lots of isolated villages, where women, once they married, they would move away from their family and friends into a fairly isolated situation with their husband's family and so on. And this script developed that was passed down from mother to daughter, which allowed women to share their experiences of domestic life. It allowed them to complain and to talk about the hardships of their life. It allowed them to maintain friendships and family ties. But it was completely secret, and only women communicated in this way. And it was sort of rediscovered in the 1950s, but then the Cultural Revolution made it a sort of, they really quashed it. So it was an offence to work with this language, or to be interested in this language, or to talk about this language in any way. But these days it's now being rediscovered again, and men and women are learning about it. But I found it really fascinating, because language finds a way in times of need. We find ways to communicate with each other. And what I found when I was writing this book, what I realized is that sometimes we use the same words that the dominant culture uses, but we just use them differently. And one of the things about the English language is that it is constantly changing. And sometimes it's changing because various groups pick up some words and they say, essentially, the way you've defined it is not adequate to my experience, and I'm going to use it differently. And then my friends use it differently, and my social group uses it that way. And suddenly a word that we have been using one way for 100 years is suddenly being used a different way, because it's found a new purpose. And that's what language does.
I wanted to touch on this point in terms of claiming back words. There's a sense of when we're talking about the women's movement, there's a sense of words that have been used that are meant to patronize, denigrate, or margin, or minimize women's experiences. Then women claim back the word. And when I was listening to one of your interviews, one really stood out, which is suffragette.
Yes.
Please tell us about that word and the claiming back of that word.
I'd love to. So suffragette's such an interesting word. I feel like in the novel, it's a very conventional novel in that, it has characters that have a story arc and they change over time. But there are certain words in the novel as well that to me were a bit like characters. They had their own story arc. They interacted with the environment around them and with people around them and changed, just like a human can. And one of those words was suffragette. So the word suffragette was coined in 1906 by newspapermen who were very anti-suffrage movement. They did not believe women should vote, but they were very offended by the actions of what we now call the suffragettes. And the suffragettes were, in a way, they didn't represent all women who were fighting for the vote. They really were the women who were part of the WSPU, which was the Women's Social and Political Union. And that was headed up by Emmeline Pankhurst. And so some of the people tuning in might know her name and know about her particular organisation. And they differed to many of the other suffrage organisations in that they used protest, they broke the law, they
committed arson.
That's right. So they used far more, I suppose, newsworthy actions to try and get the vote, to try and get attention. So they knew that, they had been doing this for decades. They knew that they were not getting the attention they needed by writing polite letters and marching with banners. And so they started to muck up. They started to behave badly. And they did. They broke the law by acts of vandalism. They actually, not everyone agreed with how they behaved, including within the suffrage movement. A lot of organisations were very against how the WSPU enacted their activism, because they put people at risk as well. So they also planted letter bombs at certain points in time. They put themselves at risk, absolutely. And that's what women do around the world. They would march, but they would also put themselves in harm's way. They were jailed very often, and these were the women who were subjected to forced feeding when they decided to go on hunger strike. So initially they were treated as political prisoners, and they were given a certain level of, I suppose, privilege within the jail system, but then they were just treated as ordinary criminals, and they would go on hunger strike, and then they would be force fed, which is, the way I've seen it described, essentially is like a rape. And so these women endured an enormous amount, but they were seen by the shock jocks of the day, the newspaper men. They were seen as less than the suffragists, who were the women who were being polite, the women who were marching and writing letters and, going about it in a polite, friendly way. And they were seen as little girls mucking up. And they were called suffragettes by these newspaper men because the ETTE on the end of suffrage, the et, is a diminutive. It's the same way, we use in language cigarette, serviette, kitchenette. It means smaller than, less than. And so a suffragette was less than a suffragist, one of those more mature women who wants to try and get the vote just by chatting to us and, writing letters. But what happened was Emmeline Pankhurst, very cleverly, she decided that we are not going to be put down by this word. We are going to use it. We are going to appropriate the word and change its meaning. And she did it in a heartbeat. This is the front cover of the journal that the WSPU put out, and they called it the Suffragette. And from that moment, in a heartbeat, she changed the meaning of this word from one that was derogatory and diminutive to one that we still use, sometimes inappropriately, like we get it wrong a little bit, but we still use it as the flagship for the suffrage movement. And I know politicians who use the word suffragette instead of suffragists. We just call all women who've been fighting for the vote suffragettes because she was that successful in changing the meaning of the word. And it's just wonderful. The thing about the word suffragette, though, that I also find interesting when I was looking at the history of how the word was initially used and looking at those newspaper articles where they talk about those young women who they called suffragettes, the words and the language that they use reminded me and was sometimes, not word for word, but absolutely paraphrased. It reminded me of the way young women who are climate activists are talked about in the media today. Mm-hmm. So Greta Thunberg, for instance, the way that she was talked about in the media was people would say things like, she has mental health issues, she should be better looked after by her father, which these are the things that were said about suffragettes, that these women should be better cared for by their husbands and fathers. These women have, they're insane, they have mental health issues. These women should be better cared for, basically, and kept quiet. And that same language is used around young women who are fighting for climate action. And I'm sure young women who are fighting other causes as well. It's a very easy way to diminish what you're saying if you diminish the capacity of the person who's saying it.
Mhm. I mean, certainly across the history of all of our countries, hysteria, mania, that sort of thing, that sort of words have been used to deny women to be judges, and deny women's abilities to lead nations, to be ministers, and therefore were parked in certain type of industries that were more about caring and nurturing, which is also one of the reasons why we have such a huge gap in inequalities of income.
Absolutely.
So it was a system propped up exactly for that reason. Pip, I wanted, because you mentioned the suffragette movement, I wanted to, we talked a little bit about this before, but you said that, you didn't have an agenda writing. This book is not about the women's suffrage movement. It's not a protest novel. It's not a feminist manifesto. um, and and you say that there's a place for other forms of activism in this book. Even if you don't use the word activism, can you explain more about Esme? I mean, she was different from Tilda, who was her friend and suffragette. Yes.
Yeah. So when I started writing this book, I was interested in the dictionary. That's the idea that I had, and that's the story I wanted to tell. I very, very quickly realized that the dictionary was developed at a time of huge social upheaval in the United Kingdom in particular, but around the world. I couldn't ignore the suffrage movement. And in fact, the suffrage movement, having read the history of the suffrage movement in the UK, it tracks parallel to the development of the dictionary so beautifully. Even with the dictionary was finally published in 1928, and just a few weeks later, women got full equal rights to men in Parliament. Just a few weeks later, they got the suffrage bill went through, even though they got some partial rights back in 1918. Not all women got access to the vote in 1918, but all women got access on an equal footing with men in 1928. So the two histories run parallel. And I was really curious I had this character who was, she was reserved. She was quiet. She was not the sort of person, say today, who would necessarily go out and shout on the hustings. She wouldn't necessarily march. She wouldn't shout, but she was still interested in gaining the freedoms, the equality, the rights that the suffragettes who we were just talking about were interested in. She had the same desires to be heard, but she didn't have the same way of being an activist. So her friend Tilda, who is an actress, an orator, an attention seeker, someone who feels energized by going out and shouting and marching and trying to convince with her words and her language and her verve and energy. Esme is the opposite to that. She hasn't got that kind of a character, and she doubts herself, and she wonders about her place in this fight that is happening all around her. She wonders if she's impotent, if she's unable to participate, and what does that mean for her if she's not brave enough in a way to be like Tilda, if she's not brave enough to go to jail and starve herself. And it really made me interrogate myself as well, because I'm probably more like Esme than I am like Tilda. I think, just to be able to sit in a room by myself for 2 years and write a book, that probably says it all. And I sort of had to interrogate my own activism, if you like. Of course, I will march, but I won't shout. I don't shout, and I'm not an organizer. And I have wondered many times, is that because I'm not brave enough? Is that because I'm not committed enough. And in some ways, I did explore that a little bit in this novel. And Esme's godmother gives Esme some advice when she's expressing these sorts of things to her. And she essentially says, there is a role for everyone. And there are many ways to communicate what it is that you think is important. And just as there are many ways to communicate what you think is important, there are many ways of receiving it, which is, I think, what we were talking about earlier. Some people respond to the letter bombs and the graffiti and the shouting and the disruption. And because so many people respond to that, it means it's necessary. Other people respond to subtler forms of communication. Other people will reject a full-on, they will reject the shouting and the disruption, but they might be swayed by a quieter action. They might be persuaded by something they've heard on the radio or heard in a song or a poem or perhaps a novel, which isn't actually telling them what to think. It's just, I suppose, it's just presenting something in a different way and stimulating thought rather than directing thought, if that makes sense. And so, I kind of, in some ways, was enacting an issue that I had come across, doing my own research, something that I found problematic perhaps in myself. I then was exploring it through the novel to some extent and trying to understand it. And novels never provide answers. If they do provide an answer, they're not really a novel. They are more manifestos or polemics or whatever. But what I think novels can do is raise questions that then stimulate thought. And the answer that you have come to on your own, not because someone was telling you what to think.
Yes, and Pip, I really that what you said really resonates with me, because I also think that the mundane ways we subvert, the impositions of our lives, the ordinary things, in societies where women are not allowed to cycle because their families are afraid the hymen may tear. When they cycle, it's an act of activism, even if one cannot define it as such. And so when a lady sings on the top of her lungs in a society where her voice should be muffled and whispered, that I think is a form of activism.
Absolutely.
I think many of us, even myself, who I define myself as an activist before anything else, I'm an activist. I always ask myself, what's my role in this struggle? Where are my talents best placed? If I were to write, am I writing a policy? Am I writing a book? Am I writing an article? And how am I deploying words to achieve my goals? But musicians are also activists. I mean, how much music moves us? Sometimes when drafting something as bland as a policy, behind me is some humongous flamboyant music that's playing in the background that's driving the energies. So I think it's really good that from this book, what I'm taking is that we all should and can have a place in activism in these various forms, and books are certainly one very special way, because this will last 1,000 years, maybe 2,000 years. Women in the next generations will pick this up, and whether fortunately or unfortunately, it resonates with our times. The themes brought up here in this book resonate with these times as well.
Yes.
So I really appreciated what you said about that. Pip, can I just mention one thing? So actually, I came across this book, I'll Fly Away, by Rudy Francisco. He's an African American poet, and I'm going to send you a copy of this
Oh,
book.
please. Yes, thank you.
And in the one of the pages has a poem, and it says, "What's the word for that in English?" Question mark. And there I am trying to catch the breeze with a butterfly net. I fumble through the only language I know and find everything but an answer.
Yes.
Eventually, I give up and say, I don't think there is one. English is the shiniest hammer I own, but it's also the only thing in my toolbox. I use it all the time, but there is so much it also cannot do. Interesting, no?
Oh, it's absolutely everything we were talking about before, how it can be so inadequate. And sometimes you have to find other ways of saying things. And sometimes it's not with words. I mean, in the novel, because the novel is also a sort of love story, and there are a lot of, important things that happen in the life of the main character. And not many people notice this, but I'm so gratified when they do. But when the most important things happen to her, there are actually no words. So words are not used at certain times in her life to express certain emotions, because in fact words are not up to the task of some experiences. War is one of those things. We have these words that they try to catch everything about war. Horror is a word that is used, throughout commentary about the experience of being in the trenches, for instance, in World War I, and I'm sure is being used now around the world in various conflicts. There are no words really to describe what happens to a person who experiences war firsthand in the trenches, if you like. And the word that we then tend to fall back on is the word horror, because we all have a bit of an understanding of the many, many things that word might contain. But actually nothing really can describe the experience of so many things, which I sometimes wonder is why, with, when people are traumatized, what sometimes happens is they become mute, because there is no way of expressing what has happened to them. Yeah. There's another interesting thing that sort of you were talking about earlier. We were talking about that Nushu language that the women used. They never spoke it, not in conversation like we're having now. They only wrote it down, or they sang it. And they would sometimes sing it, in their compounds. And women in another compound would hear the song. And the song was often about the trauma of their life. Mm-hmm. And this is how they shared what was going on and how they survived it. Because sometimes you can't really survive unless you can share your experience. Yeah. And if the words are inadequate, you find another way. Poetry, he has found a way to express something without saying it directly, which is beautiful.
And so therefore, if a lot of oral traditions are passed in the form of poetry, in fact, that is a source of information of women's experiences and their complaints and their celebrations, no?
Absolutely. I totally agree. And the poem that you just read out then as well, I think is an example of how you use words that are inadequate, you fashion them in a way that makes them adequate. So even though there might not be the right number of, the right words might not exist, but sometimes when you use the wrong words in a particular fashion, you group them in a particular way. You use them as building blocks to build something new. He, in that poem, he actually created an understanding for me of something that he was experiencing without using a single word that described it. He created meaning from those words.
And Pip, even so I'm a lawyer, so there is the word genocide, which in legal terms mean this killing with specific intent a person on the basis of race or ethnicity and religion. And in fact, this word genocide, of course, it has roots in Latin, but it was campaigned by a Polish lawyer who was exiled from his town in Poland when the Nazi Germans were encroaching upon went to war with Poland. And he escaped, and he had tried so hard. If we read into the history of this term genocide, he tried so hard battling with the British lawyers and the American lawyers who were in control of the Nuremberg trials. They were drafting the indictments, and an indictment contains charges. Charges are what defines what act comprise of a crime. He battled with them, and he says, I want genocide, this word, to be in it. But genocide, because it's such a horrific word, to just use this word horror, it really exposes our inhumanities, our deep inhumanities. They said the word is too flamboyant, it's too outlandish. Imagine, and he succeeded. The word genocide was brought into the Nuremberg trials, and now it's part of international law. But I mean, it's not that long ago when it didn't even exist.
Yes, and if it didn't exist, it meant that the crime couldn't have happened in some ways. If you can't label something, it means it doesn't exist in many people's, as far as many people are concerned. It happens with so many things. It's mental health or mental illness, physical illness, the law. There are so many places where if we don't have a word that we can use to define a particular experience, then the experience goes unacknowledged, unheard, unvalidated. It becomes not important, and therefore it doesn't become addressed. Change doesn't happen around it. I think the same is happening at the moment with gender identity and sexuality. If the reason there are so many letters in LGBTQIA+, the reason there are so many letters is because people are finally finding a way to identify themselves. They are finally finding a language that explains who they are. And it's important that we all use those words that people are claiming for themselves. And the fact that we had such a binary understanding, perhaps, of gender in the not too distant past, you can imagine now how damaging that would be to someone who doesn't identify as he or she, for instance, and what that might mean to the way you are in the world and who you see yourself as and how other people see you if you can't actually put yourself within the meaning of those two words. And so I see, it's just constantly happening where we're realizing that there are different ways of being in the world, and our language is always going to be behind our experience. And we have to embrace the new language that comes up. And young people are often at the forefront of creating language, I think, because, they're the most imaginative, they're the most, they're looking at the world anew. They're not, I'm such a, I'm dyslexic actually, so I'm not great with words. But I used to be one of those people who was a bit of a stickler for grammar. once I understood. But these days.
We will not get along, Pip.
No. Well, and these days I'm the complete opposite. I because I've written about a dictionary, I have a lot of people who are very, they really like words to be used correctly. They really like correct grammar and so on. And they think they'll find an ally in me. In fact, I'm so enthusiastic about the way young people, people who are speaking English as a second language, people who live in cultural or social situations that are diverse in relationship to, to the people who sort of rule their countries. I am such an advocate of how they manipulate language to suit their needs, and that we need to listen to that because it tells us a little bit about their experience and what's important to them. And it's just constantly evolving, and we should listen to how it evolves because it will tell us a little bit about people's experience.
You know, I came across from a book by the author Azar Nafisi, and she describes the within the first chapter of Mark Twain's book, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, and he was chided for writing the way ordinary people speak.
Yeah.
And the word and she says the fact that the word civilization begins with the letter S, in itself, the construction sets the tone for what that this book is going to break the boundaries of language, and that's really illuminating.
It is illuminating, and because what he was doing also, although I don't know, I don't know the details, but what an author is doing when they use that kind of vernacular spelling is they're respecting the context that they're writing about. When they do that, they're giving it a louder voice than it might have had if he used the correct spelling. It's wonderful.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Will you show us the slips?
Yes, I will. Okay, I'll show you a few little goodies.
Okay, thank you. Now is the show and tell segment. Yeah.
Show and tell. So, like I said, I had wonderful access to the archives. And these are photocopies, but they're the real size. So they're photocopies, and then I cut them down. I just cut them down. So this is a slip for Bondmaid. So these are the slips that went missing. So we don't know what happened to the original. The way it worked is that they would have all the slips. So these are examples. I'll just put a few of them up. These are examples of the word Bondmaid and how they were used in history. So this is Shakespeare from 1596. So it's a quote from one of his plays that uses the word bondmaid or a similar type of word. So sometimes it's bondmaiden, sometimes it's bondmaid as one whole word, other times it's, two words separated. So these are the slips that were used to define the word, and they eventually used the definition slave girl. It was that simple. So bondmaid is defined as slave girl. There's no other definitions of it in the dictionary. But what was missing was the top slip. So these are the things that were just sent in by sorry, my screen is just oh, there we go. Something came up on my screen. I didn't know what it was. These are the slips that were sent in by volunteers, but then a lexicographer would go through them and create a top slip. And the top slip would have the word and the definition that was going to be in the dictionary. And that's the bit that went missing. So that never ended up where it should have ended up at the Oxford University Press, where they then typeset it and print it. But when I went into the archives and I went into the boxes full of slips, I found all of the original slips in the original handwriting. It's just extraordinary. So that's an example of the slips. But the other thing that I have that I can show you is this is an example of one of the proof pages. So you can see, it's they were quite large. So the dictionary has 2 columns, and you can see how much editing went on before it was finally printed. And this has, I don't think it has an example of a word that's excised, but it's got a whole lot of little additions and edits. And sometimes they'd have a little slip of paper stuck on the side with a new entry, and other times they'd just have a big line through a word that they decided they didn't want anymore. The other thing that you might be interested in, at the end of the novel, and it's not really a spoiler because it is part of the history, this is also one of the things that really, I suppose, it was one of those motivating factors to write this story. When I was looking at the history of the dictionary, I found just stories that when the dictionary was finally published in 1928, they celebrated it with a great dinner at the Goldsmiths Hall in London. And I read about this dinner and found out that only men were invited. But what I knew about the dictionary is that a number of women had worked on the dictionary, and some of those women had worked on the dictionary for decades of their life.
Wow.
One of those women is in my novel. Her name is Edith Thompson. She was a volunteer, so she never got paid for her contribution. But she wasn't just sending in slips. She was being asked to do some of this editing of the dictionary and to find definitions for particular words. And what I found out was at this dinner, only men were invited, but 3 women were given permission to watch the men eat from the balcony. And one of those women was Edith Thompson, who worked on the dictionary for 50 years of her life. And she's given credit as a volunteer in every single one of the volumes. Another one was Eleanor Bradley, who was the daughter of one of the other editors, and she was paid to work on the dictionary for about 40 years of her life. And the other woman that was invited was Ross Frith Murray, who was the daughter of James Murray, who also worked on the dictionary for decades of her life. And they got to watch the men eat salmon. I've got the menu for this dinner. They ate salmon. They had turtle soup, asparagus. Oh, it's just, ham, champagne ham. I've got the wine list. It's extraordinary. And I also have the seating arrangement. And I just couldn't believe some of the people so this is the seating arrangement. So every single man that was invited is written on here. And it includes Tolkien, who wrote Lord of the Rings, because he worked on the dictionary as an assistant for 18 months. He defined the words walrus and warlock. Can you believe it? He was invited, even though he'd only worked on the dictionary for 18 months. Other people were invited who'd never worked on the dictionary, but had written articles about it. So they might have been newspaper men. A school teacher was invited. He'd never worked on the dictionary, but he was a friend of a friend. And yet these women who dedicated their lives to it probably sat on a fairly uncomfortable bench in the balcony and just watched them eat. And this imagery of that, the symbolism of that was kind of extraordinary. So, there are other things that I found in the archives, the detail of those things makes it so real. And some of it I include in the novel and other bits I fictionalize. But, yeah.
But that was the way in which you could resurrect Edith and, I guess, recognize her contributions to the dictionary, no?
Yeah, that's right. And I had an ethical dilemma really about using her, because I've turned her into Esme's godmother, and Esme's fictional. She never existed. So the ethical dilemma that I had was using this woman, this real woman, and I suppose using her real name and fictionalizing her life, and in so doing kind of making up to some extent who she was, which of course I can't know. I can know some things because sort of in the archives, I also came across many letters that she wrote to James Murray. Yeah, and also to the Murray girls, the daughters of James Murray and his wife. I had a sense of her personality, which I've tried to be true to in the novel. I loved her so much. She did remind me a lot of my mother-in-law as well. So it was kind of nice to be able to, I could kind of combine the characteristics of the two. But the dilemma I had was, normally in fiction, if you do make somebody up to such an extent, you would just give them a different name. You'd give them a pseudonym, and at the end you would say that this character was based on Edith Thompson. But she had had such an important role in the dictionary. And when I look at the historical record all I could find was about half a page of information about her. Very little. And the only reason I found that is because she wrote a biography of her grandfather, who was a parliamentarian. And actually, he was very instrumental in universal suffrage, which another wonderful word. So the word universal suffrage never included women. So in terms of universal, yeah, that's right. It was that was all about giving men equal rights. So working class men and men from different backgrounds, the same rights as the ruling classes. And so she wrote a biography of him, and that's the only reason we know anything about her, really, because of her relationship to a man. And so I really didn't want to give her a pseudonym. I wanted to use her real name in my novel because I thought she deserved to be known. And so what I did is, whenever she's in conversation with Esme gives her a nickname, which is Dita. And that nickname is fictional. And that's what Esme calls her. And so all of the scenes that really include Esme, she's known as Dita. But whenever she's doing her dictionary work, she's known as Edith Thompson. She signs her letters Edith Thompson. Everyone refers to her as Edith Thompson whenever it's in relationship to the dictionary. And I never really made up anything in terms of her work on the dictionary. That all comes from the historical records. So that's the way I dealt with that. But it was so important to me that I don't excise her from my book. Once again.
For lack of information, you would then excise her further if you had not included her.
That's right. And it seems like a kind of, a continual excising from history is women. We don't know so much about women through history because they weren't written into the history. And in some ways that then restricts our ability to write about them continuously. And so I think that's where fiction can really fill many, many gaps in history. People understand that fiction makes stuff up, but there is an emotional, social, cultural truth that can resonate in fiction that is often missing from history. And I think that while we understand that a lot of fiction is made up, we can also understand that the gap that it fills in our historical understanding of the world is still true in a small t way. We wouldn't believe it otherwise. And it's true because human beings essentially haven't changed very much for hundreds and thousands of years. Yeah. We still have the same desires and goals. Women still want more of a voice than they've got. People don't want to be enslaved. They never have wanted to be enslaved. Do you know what I mean? Our circumstances might be different. Our clothes might be different. Our homes and technologies might be different, but actually we are the same as we've been for millennia. So I think we understand people of the past. Yeah.
Truly, actually, because of the crisis that's happening in Iran, I took it on myself to read more Iranian literature because it portals you to other worlds and gives you new words to describe experiences maybe that you haven't described in English, no? Yeah. But what is truly sad, and even the book which was translated, it's called 1,000 Years of Persian Poetry by Women, and it's translated by Dick Davis. But unfortunately, for some of these women poets, in terms of their biography, there are only 3 or 4 lines to describe them, and nothing more. No. And what I like about what you said about Edith is that in order to know her, you had to read her letters.
Yes.
And oftentimes I think we privilege or we put nonfiction in a higher hierarchy. There's a hierarchy, like academic journals are unsurpassable. The Bible and the Quran is unsurpassable, right? And you have hierarchy of other scriptures and books. and poems and poetry letters, which are like everyday correspondences talking about domestic life, and seem to be and not as important. But
Yeah.
when you go down to it, you get, like you said, you got to understand who Edith was. And I think the same. I started to read a little bit also more about the sayings and the words of one of the Prophet Muhammad's wives, Aisha, um,
Mm.
and of course people in our culture speak of her highly and respect her. But the words I would use to describe her: she's rebellious, she's witty, she's a jealous person, she's smart,
Yeah.
um, and she has the characteristics of your modern day protester, you know.
Yeah. And didn't she lead an army?
Yeah, and then she led an army, and
Yeah.
they call it the Battle of the Camel, but they never talk about the woman on the camel's back,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
So I like that we resurrect people from history, even if we put them in fiction, or we get to know them through works that are not categorized as of the highest peer-reviewed type. No.
I completely agree. And as a scientist, so I was a social scientist and I published
Yeah.
lots of papers in peer-reviewed journals. And what I would also say is that history and biography and, well, you know, even the dictionary and encyclopedias, they are not objective works. You know, there is subjectivity all the way through. Every piece of research that is done starts with a question that comes from a human being with a particular agenda, with a particular experience of whatever it is that they're studying. And their experience is going to influence the question they ask and how they answer it. And even if it is published in the highest, best reviewed journal or published as non-fiction and therefore truth, I think we still have to question where it's coming from and what the agenda is of the person who's written it. And I think fiction, poetry, letters, these things can give us as much understanding of the real world as any non-fiction can do. And at least it's transparent about its, you know, about where it's coming from. It's not clothing itself as objective. And it's left to the reader to glean what they want from a book. And that happens too. That's the wonderful thing I think about fiction. When I speak to people about my book, some people think it's all about motherhood. And I never intended to write about motherhood. Other people think it's all about feminism. And like you said, I'm a feminist, proudly. I didn't have a feminist agenda, though, going in, but I am a feminist. So, of course, it's going to have, that aspect of my interest in the book. People finish books, I think. Once the book is on the shelf, I sort of feel like I got it about 80% of the way there. And then every single time someone picks it up and reads it, they are finishing it for me.
Yeah, very
And
nice.
for some people, the finished novel is going to be about something that really matters to them. And for other people, the finished novel is about something different because their experience is different. And I love that about novels. And I find it myself when I read novels. My friends and I can have a completely different idea about what the main point of a novel was. And it's because of our own experience.
Yes, and as a reader, I think you come into periods of your life. I mean, for me, because of the situation in Afghanistan, and so it was a period of crises. And you then, when you enter the book, you take with it something your life needs for the moment.
Yeah.
And we are all, as human beings, we are all going through some difficulty or some challenge of sorts. And one can read a self-help book and feel even more insecure by the 5 key ways to be happy. Or one can read a fiction and it doesn't tell you how to live your life, but it reveals something and a message that you may not be able to articulate in words, words being inadequate sometimes, but then you feel changed by it, no?
Yeah, yeah. And sometimes sometimes speaking as the author, you haven't necessarily consciously written anything. You haven't written the thing that the reader takes from it in a way. But I think if you have been genuine in your desire to articulate humanity, if that was a genuine desire and you tried to do that in your storytelling, then it means that you might have captured some aspect of humanity that, even though you might not recognize it or be able to label it, it's an honest appraisal of humanity, and someone else who has more experience than you in that area will be able to articulate it for you. So even as an author, I can't always articulate what it is I might be representing on the page. It's just that I have honestly tried to capture the human experience. It's just that I don't always know what it is I'm capturing. A bit like a photographer can take a picture, but it's only the viewer that can tell you what's in it sometimes, because some viewers will have a more personal, direct experience of whatever it is the photographer took a picture of. Even though the picture was beautifully framed and so on, the photographer might not understand what it is that they've done, but the reader will, or the viewer will.
Pip, after you've written this book and you've had many conversations with different people, what are you working on now that you're excited?
Well, I actually, hold on a minute, just a tip.
I love your wallpaper.
My wallpaper.
The wallpaper. Sorry, I'm assuming it's a wallpaper. Is it?
No, it's stone. Yeah, no, that's stone.
Oh, beautiful! Yeah, very nice.
My partner built. It's a straw bale house with some stone walls.
You see, I come from Singapore. There's no such thing as a stone wall. You just assume it was a wallpaper.
Yeah. This was my partner's big project. So
very nice. Beautiful.
So I just printed this morning the final proof of my next book. So it's called The Bookbinder of Jericho. And it's actually, you got me on a good day, Natasha. So it's actually
one of the first to see it.
Yeah, you are, because I literally printed it, but it's being laid out for kind of they call them advanced reader copies. So it needs to be proofread, but it's pretty much finished. So it's actually a companion to the Dictionary of Lost Words, and it's called The Bookbinder of Jericho, and it's about a woman who works in the bindery at Oxford University Press, and she's been told that her job is to bind the books, not read them. And it's all she's a really intelligent young woman, and all she's ever dreamed of is going to Oxford University. And she literally works across the road from the Women's College at Oxford University. And really it's a story it's set during World War I. It's got a few of the characters from the dictionary are in this book as well. So Tilda is in this story, and so is Gareth. But she's a working class woman. And we were talking before, you were talking about the book you're reading of poetry, through the ages, written by women. When I was researching this book, I was looking for any kind of literature or artwork done by women during World War I. And in a similar way, this women's poetry, for instance, even though they actually, during World War I, women wrote and published almost as much poetry as men at the time. But when we look at anthologies of World War I poetry, there's barely a woman acknowledged in those anthologies, despite the amount of poetry that was actually published during World War I from women. And so women's experience of World War I has been minimised because we're not reading their poetry, we're not reading their books. having said that, I have found, examples of women's poetry. There was an anthology produced that was just women's poetry from World War One, but not produced until the 1990s. So I've got that. I've read novels written by women who'd lived through World War One, biographies and also memoirs. But it's all written by working class, well-educated working class women. And it made me obviously again think, well, what about the voices of working class women? Often when we recreate women who've been left out of history, when we revisit their lives, we're revisiting the lives of wealthier, more educated women, because they're the women that have, if they haven't contributed, we don't know much about them, but we know something about them because they were usually connected to a man, or they were the daughter of, or the wife of, or and so that's how we know about them, and their name is in history. But there are so many women who are left out completely because they were illiterate and they were not related to a man who made it into the history book. So I've still had to sort of fictionalize to some extent the experience of being a working class woman during World War One, and that's what I really wanted to do. And so there's a crossover with the Dictionary of Lost Words, because they share a location, but they also share a time, and they share a couple of people. But I've really enjoyed this book as well. So I think it'll be out in this. Well, I know it will be out in Australia at the end of March next year, and then it will be out in the US and the UK around July, August. So I think Singapore, you've got the US cover. So I think in terms of Singapore, a book being in the bookshop, it's probably August. But yeah.
Long.
Yeah.
So long. We have to wait so long more. But what does Jericho mean?
Jericho is the name of Jericho is obviously a very famous place, but it's also the name of the I suppose these days you'd call it a suburb, but it was the town of Jericho, and it's butts up against Oxford, and it's the place where Oxford University Press is. It's this extraordinary kind of stone building in the middle of this very, very, very working class part of Oxford. It's these days it's an incredibly wealthy part of Oxford, like a lot of these places have become. But back in the day, 100 years ago, it was a very, very poor part of Oxford, but it was where all of the books for Oxford University were printed and bound.
Wow.
So that's where she lives, and she lives on a narrowboat on the Oxford Canal. So
wow.
So that's
I think I think so many of us readers we're so excited to get this new gift, and glad that it's somehow connected to, because we can't let go of this book here, the Dictionary of Lost Words yet.
I couldn't either. I wasn't done with that part of the world and that time in history. And also I realized, I had written a book about a middle-class woman, because women were between the lines, if you like, of the Oxford English Dictionary. But something that I sort of did on purpose is there's a working class woman in that book, and that's Lizzie. Yeah. But I don't write very much about her life. I don't give her too much of a voice. And I do that on purpose, because in so many ways, if women were writing, if they were acknowledged, it was almost always middle class and well-educated women who had a voice, if they had a voice at all, if women had a voice at all. But working class women, had even less of a voice. And so this time I wanted to write from the perspective of a working class woman. So that's what I've done.
That's really, really beautiful. Thank you so much, Pip, for this time, for the show and tell, and for being part of this conversation. It will energize me for the rest of the week.
I've enjoyed it so much, Natasha, and I so respect, obviously, the work that you do. And I have found a way of being an activist that that makes me feel comfortable, and it's quiet. And I tell it slant, but this is, I feel more comfortable than I used to about, participating.
Yeah, but it's quiet because it's silent in the form of
Yeah.
words, but see how much it resonates. So it's
Yeah.
sometimes the quietness is loud, right?
Yeah. And it only is because people read, and
Yeah.
I really
And that's the importance of reading, because
yes. Yeah.
it's the way we access world, it's the way we find new words to describe experiences, and it reminds us to go back to the experiences of those who have been marginalized,
Yes.
even in this day.
Yeah, I totally agree. And it's given me access to people like you who I wouldn't have had access to before. People.
Our worlds will not have come across each other.
Yeah. I'm very, very grateful. And I hope we get to chat again. I'd love to do that. So
Absolutely, Pip. And may I just grant your day a little bit of sunshine? This is Nala.
Oh, he's gorgeous. He's huge. I thought when you were telling me about him, I thought he was going to be small and fluffy. Oh, she's beautiful.
Yeah, she's Nala, and she's adventurous. She takes the unbeaten path. She never listens. Sometimes she's everything a woman should be.
Yeah. And she's your pup from Australia, is she?
She's Australian.
Yeah.
My Singaporean boy is a little bit more quiet.
Yeah. She's beautiful.
Well, thank you so much, and have a really wonderful rest of your day.
I will. Thank you so much, Natasha. I've loved